Welcome to our webinar on BRICS in Action, a deep dive into the outcomes of the 2025 summit. The BRICS summit in Brazil, Rio de Janeiro, took place last Sunday and Monday. News here in Germany and presumably elsewhere, at least in non-BRICS countries, have been present but scarce and very much limited to short 5-minute interviews, which just managed to touch upon the very basics. An explanation of what BRICS is, what key themes were, and why Xi Jinping was not there. Today, we are having an expert conversation on highlights, lowlights, consequences of the summit that go beyond the headlines. And I'm very happy to welcome here in this Giga Forum a stellar panel of international, highly renowned experts on the BRICS who have worked and specialized on this topic for many years and will be able to give you an in-depth insight into the topic that you will surely struggle to find anywhere else. Before I introduce the panel, a few housekeeping notes. The event consists of 2 parts. First, our panel discussion for about 40 minutes, which will leave us roughly 30 minutes for an interactive part with the audience, for Q&A, comments, and your thoughts. We are already able to collect your questions via the chat, via Q&A, and please continue to posting your questions there. You will unfortunately not be able to post your questions orally yourself, but please post them in writing and I will read them out to the panelists. So join me in welcoming our panelists today. Dr. Mihaela Papa is the Director of Research and Principal Research Scientist at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Center for International Studies, where she leads the BRICS Lab. For over a decade, Dr. Papa has published extensively on the BRICS, including on its evolution as a coalition, BRICS-US relations, monetary issues, and climate policies. Dr. Damyana Bakardzhieva is the Senior Research Fellow in charge of the Economic Diplomacy Program at the Anwar Gargash Diplomatic Academy in Abu Dhabi, the UAE official candidate for the BRICS Think Tank Council. Gustavo de Carvalho is a senior researcher at the African Governance and Diplomacy Program of the South African Institute of International Affairs, specializing in BRICS dynamics, global South geopolitics, and multilateralism. They're joining us today from China, Rio de Janeiro, and Singapore. So we'll have a very international panel today. My name is Miriam Brüß-Hansen. I'm a lead research fellow here at GIGA, head of the research program on global orders and foreign policy. I work on BRICS, specifically on India, multi-alignment strategies. My first publication on the BRICS actually appeared in 2011. And obviously mine is always an outsider perspective on the topic, but I have been a keen observer over the years and I'm very excited for our panel today. We have agreed to structure the panel discussion today, as said, as a conversation among us rather than a question and answer session alone. So again, to the panelists, please feel free to interrupt me, interrupt us, and ask your own questions, respond to questions that were not addressed to you in the first place, and so on. And as said, we want to go beyond the headlines and dive into specific outcomes of the event, but also their wider implication for BRICS' meaning and impact in the world. Here in Germany, again, the main question when it comes to BRICS are questions that I've been asked in interviews. What is the BRICS? What is it that this diverse group wants? Are they achieving it? How anti-Western, anti-US is all of this? And the panel will clearly touch upon these broader questions. But as we said, we also see much value into dissecting the actual summit and its wider implications beyond the headlines. The panel will clearly, as said, discuss the broader questions. And first, to start us off, I would like to clarify a few common standpoints that we share among the panel, while we likely disagree on others. First, BRICS meetings are meaningful for a variety of reasons, particularly in times of Trump. They continue to be an attractive forum for many from the global South. Their effectiveness and actual impact is much to be debated. BRICS members, for the most, are critical of many aspects of the international order, but are not anti-Western overall. And it is, third, a diverse group with diverse interests. Yet central for most is the promise BRICS holds in terms of economic diversification and resilience, getting new trading partners, mostly China. But beyond that, BRICS, by all of them, is used for their specific preferences. India wants counterterrorism in, Brazil sustainability, and Iran a focus on sovereignty. And this has led, if you have read as we did, the declaration leading to a colorful bouquet of 32 pages of desires, commitments, supports of debates, etc., and only hints of tangible results. For me personally, a relative surprise was the strong statement in Iran, the very clear messaging on climate leadership, which, however, I have a lot of questions looking at the role that fossil fuels play in basically all of the members, and the absence of any progress on making BRICS as an institution more reliable, more predictable in light of an expanding membership. So let me turn to our panel for our first round of questions. Mihaela, if you may. I'm not sure you have your camera on. I can't see you right now, but I'll still ask the question. What, in your opinion, were the key results? What expectations have been fulfilled? Where has the summit surprisingly or expectedly failed to bring in the tangible and concrete results desired?
Thank you for the question. So it's an honor to be here. I wanted to start maybe with the very basics. It was discussed who are actually new members and new partners over the last 6 months, and who will be actually in and who won't be in. And the most important part for the future of BRICS is that it's now clear there are like one new member is in declaration, the new partners are in declaration written down, so they are formalized. And the BRICS is now in as a group in an expanded form, officially with both the member and the partner belt. Usually, like thinking about the summit, we want to evaluate the summit based on whether it meets the goals of the presidency of Brazil, right? Does what Brazil promised and others agreed to put on the agenda, did it deliver there? And I would think yes, Brazil really wanted to focus on global south, on sustainable development, on bringing in climate change. So I think on all of these fronts it delivered. We see a lot of different language, new initiatives on the climate and food. There is new movement on AI. There is movement around like basic needs and thinking about the least, the most vulnerable. There is a launch of tropical forest facility. There is also like thinking about global commons and thinking about space council launch and increase in space cooperation. And then there was this surprise of BRICS investment guarantee fund to de-risk investments. So I think on that front, like overall, it was a very productive summit. Two areas which have been kind of watched in terms of institutional development were one, whether there will be some concrete institutional mechanism that comes out of the summit, because there are so many different areas to coordinate. And we haven't seen progress on that front. There are still 180 mechanisms that the academic group counted, and now we are adding here from this summit in declaration even more mechanisms. So I think here the progress was in reverse. And the other test of cooperation was the question of cohesion, because there was a lot of drama around foreign ministers, consensus building, whether there can be a consensus on UN Security Council reform. And this issue, there was progress, so we can see that the declaration is out, but at the same time, there is not really the full language with what was initially intended. So I think that I can stop there.
Thank you so much. Let's move on to Damyana. So what were highlights and lowlights from your point of view? And I think I would be specifically curious on a perspective from a new and slightly untypical BRICS members, the UAE. So it would be great to help us understand the positioning there, and maybe also delve a little bit in your specific field of expertise on sort of tariffs, the reaction to the Trump tariffs, and other developments in the realm of economic cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Miriam. Welcome to the entire audience. I think that for me, what mattered in the declaration is as much what was in there as much as what wasn't in there. And what wasn't in the declaration, in my sense, is type of anti-West language that some would have expected from this South-South type of organization. You mentioned that your first BRICS publication dates back in 2011. I must openly declare that my first publication on the BRICS dates from 2025. So I am as new to the field as is the United Arab Emirates, where I work currently. But I had the pleasure of collaborating with Gustavo on that paper. And what we looked at in that paper was precisely that for the countries that are members, and more particularly as well for the new joiners of the group is not having an anti-West objective. It is having a non-West objective. It's a South-South collaboration, but that collaboration is not targeted against the US. It's not targeted against the EU. It's not targeted against the West altogether. So what we didn't see in the declaration is a mention of the US directly, even when there was a discussion and a strong language on the proliferation of tariffs and of non-tariff measures, and a general sense that we need to work more to facilitate international trade rather than hinder from international trade. There was still no pointing fingers at the US specifically. There was no talk about de-dollarization. There was no talk about common BRICS currencies. None of those things that seem to frighten the West was part of that declaration. And I think that it's important for the BRICS as a group to keep sending that message out, because that would facilitate the voice of the South in bigger multilateral negotiations. And I would love to hear from Gustavo as well on the topic.
Great, thank you so much. It's very helpful. We'll turn to Gustavo, who was actually in Brazil, in Rio during the summit. So I'm really excited to hear your perspective about the happenings on the ground and what you have to add in terms of highlights, lowlights, and your perception of the whole thing. I think the focus can be on this consensus building mechanism. So when you were talking to delegations, what was the sense that came across there?
Thanks, and it's really great to be here amongst friends, and on the sidelines we tend to spend a lot of time talking about BRICS, and I think there's something interesting about the group, right? Like it raises emotions in different sides and expectations, and I think that the summit, on the one hand, there is incremental continuation of what has been discussed over the years, and I think that in itself is positive. Because when we look now, 2 years after the announcement of the expansion in Johannesburg in 2023, Indonesia eventually accepting joining the group now in January this year, is that we kind of starting to get a better sense of what are some of the strengths that the expansion brings, but what are some of the limitations that it creates on future decisions, but even on decisions that had already been made. And I think the declaration is very much a result of that. I think consensus within the group still has this interesting dual role for members, that is both a mechanism and a process to achieve decisions, but it's seen as a value for most of the members, because more than consensus creating some kind of a veto power of individual members, it's pushes them to negotiate what are the minimum common denominators. We saw earlier this year, and Mihaela mentioned this, and I think it's an important point, of differences on agreed language that had already been present in BRICS declarations that directly mentioned Brazil, India, and South Africa as potential candidates for a reformed Security Council. When you have 2 other African members, Ethiopia and Egypt, joining, for them there was a sore point, because the mentioning of South Africa goes against the idea of a continental consensus that was achieved in 2005, called the Zawini Consensus, and that really broke the ability of the group in April, May to have a declaration of foreign ministers, but brought really interesting language now in the declaration that talks specifically about the African claims and participation. For the first time, we have direct mentioning that Russia and China look specifically into Brazil and India as potential members of a reformed Security Council. And it really shows that the summit is important, but the process that leads month to month every year towards that summit really has that incremental value. I think, and very briefly, I think on broader aspects, it was really interesting to see BRICS really positioning itself as a champion of multilateralism in terms of the support of UN institutions, of the General Assembly, of the Economic and Social Council. A lot of concerns, even though the US is not mentioned directly, but what are the risks that it creates to a global order that BRICS members benefit enormously in terms of the World Trade Organization, change of quota mechanisms of the IMF, of the World Bank, and so on. And it helps us responding this question that is often posed: is BRICS trying to overturn the global order? I think summits like this, like previous ones, really confirm that BRICS members are not really, what they want is a seat at the table. They're not looking to eat in a completely different restaurant. But they understand that by having a seat at the table, that their role in cooking and cleaning and organizing and planning needs to be much larger, because they acknowledge that individually and collectively they have a much, they should have a much better say in how we think the world, not simply to exclude everything that we had in the last 80 years and move to a different paradigm. And that, for me, I think it's something that shows that this process of achieving consensus, moderate language to, in a way that no extreme positions within the group become really easy to be achieved, because consensus in that sense is queen.
Great, thank you so much. I think that leads perfectly over to my next question on the we'll have to also participate in the cleaning up and organizing. Brazil made a very strong case on sort of preparing and putting stuff on the agenda already for COP30, the climate change conference that will take place later in the year in Belém, in Brazil. Maybe Mihaela, but obviously everybody else is invited too. Maybe you can highlight some of the concrete outcomes there in terms of climate finance. And rather than just describing what is, I would be really curious to learn more about your ideas. But, well, there's some really big emitters in the BRICS. And among the partner countries, there are some of the more vulnerable ones. They share with Brazil and Indonesia, you have the big forest nations in there. So how does that all work? And are we blinding ourselves potentially saying, okay, BRICS is going to lead on climate change while actually, you know, it's an easy way out for them? Or is there actual substantial progress that we can look forward to, and that the more vulnerable countries of the global south can also align to? And my last point, where also, I mean, the European Union has sort of some, with CBAM, obviously there was a lot of resistance to that and a very outspoken rejection of that. But in general, I think we can see EU's trying to do leadership on climate change. Are there possibilities to connect to the BRICS agenda on that regard? That's a lot of question in one. Please, we'll start with Mihaela, and please, the others feel, I think this is a really key topic where we could see tangible results. I'm hesitant, but I'm very happy to be convinced.
So can I just ask you, can you see me? Because I had some issues.
We can see you now. Yes.
Great. So, all right. So basically where to start? So I think climate is a big result from this summit. Not so much what was discussed, but that it was discussed, and that over the last year, there have been all of these like new working groups and new basically bodies that can help with advanced action on climate change. And this is the major difference, because for a very long time, like since 2009 and then 2010 onwards, BRICS was not like a climate entity per se. It was always basic. So BRICS minus Russia. And in climate negotiation, in like all of these different negotiations. And what happened is that over time, we have been seeing more and more efforts to put climate as a separate issue. And I think this declaration really zooms in on climate as a separate And when we think about the declaration text, the length of it, and the real estate, so to say, that's dedicated to climate change, you cannot, like thinking about next year, you cannot remove easily things that are already in the declaration. And once the bodies are set up, it's very difficult to kind of unset them up or leave them or have them disappear. So from an institutional perspective, the climate action for this summit and in preparation was very important. There are several trends that are here that were there before. So for example, common but differentiated responsibilities principle. So there is the question of climate justice, climate equity. So that's still there. So another issue is green protectionism. So there has always been like very much concern about green protectionism, and actually the carbon border adjustment mechanism serves as a force to connect countries even more around that. And then there is also the question of climate finance, and I think there are several things going on here. So we don't see like any major climate like funding that came into the declaration, but what we do see is this effort to scale up climate finance, but also the effort to think about more about standards and accounting. So how do you think about carbon accounting? How do you think about standards? And I think these technical things are very important because, for example, if we remember last COP, nobody can define what is climate finance. Nobody can track climate finance. So there is a lot of debate on even like very basic things, conceptual things. How do you define? How do you track? Is like, are developed country commitments even met? So if there is an argument on that, how do you even know if they're met or not? So I think this is one area where BRICS can make a difference. Another thing that I've seen all across the declaration is that almost all roads lead to COP. So even things that are not necessarily immediately connected to COP, there was like, for example, for space, there was like a mention of COP. So I think I would stop there, but it's a good development.
If I could add something to Mihaela, and I think it's a great overview. There's one element I think for BRICS this year that created a lot of pressure in terms of the Brazilian bureaucracy. Brazil hosted G20 last year, has COP at the end of the year, and BRICS was really squeezed in between. This was the earliest summits that we can remember, particularly because COP is such an important issue within the current administration, domestic and foreign policy, meaning that I think BRICS this year really played an important role in terms of coordination of positions leading towards COP. So how countries engaged, not only during the summits, but I think particularly in the sectoral meetings that occurred over the last few months, whether it's through ministries of finance, whether it's civil society gatherings in different parts of Brazil, discussions around those issues. I think some of the messages there are quite important because it does provide the opportunity, if not a unified, but certainly a much better sense amongst members of what they're going to be pursuing in Belém later this year. I think that some of the poking towards European, perceived European protectionisms under the pretext of environmental approaches. I think this is not a small issue for a country like Brazil, considering that the language push towards a Mercosur European Union free trade agreement was very much presented within environmental concerns, but a very active pushback from French farmers in terms of what the competition would be. Countries like Indonesia, countries like Brazil, that have difficulties in terms of dealing with many of its environmental issues, but also in many ways in the vanguard of that. And perhaps there is some of the ironic aspects that some of the unexpected big champions in terms of an energy transition are within BRICS. The fact that supply chains within China are really driving a lot of the transition in many parts of the world in terms of more accessible energy, in terms of less reliant on fossil fuels, provides this dichotomy that countries, even though they are large producers of fossil fuels like oil and gas and so on, but at the same time, really trying to find ways that provides a much more gradual transition towards that. And that is relevant whether you're a country like the UAE, whether you're a country like Brazil that has this similar to Norway, produces a lot of oil, but at the same time has a fairly green energy baseline, especially in terms of hydro, and very much in line with this major supply chain changes that the Chinese engagements within solar panels, batteries, EVs are creating, particularly in the global south, and a whole new value proposition.
That's really fascinating. Damyana, I would be super interested if you had maybe something to add on that from, from your perspective, but also obviously UAE perspective would be great.
I'm pretty sure that the UAE is looking forward to the next COP and to continuing the legacy of COP28, particularly with the South leadership on the climate agenda. Now that the US has withdrawn from that leadership position, there is clearly room for the South to step up on both the negotiations and the financing and the mechanisms around that. And so for the UAE, the orderly and fair transition from fossil fuels to a green energy mix is a priority. And I think that this is part of the declaration as well. You can clearly see that fossil fuels are mentioned in the declaration. There's acknowledgement that they won't disappear tomorrow morning. That would be unreasonable, particularly for a lot of the developing countries for which fossil fuels are still a major source in the energy mix, but that there is obviously a desire to move away from them and to green the energy mix further and further, as much as that is possible by providing financing to do that. And speaking of financing, it's not just climate finance that is an important part of the declaration. Development finance in general is, and there is probably one of the most tangible things that came out of this whole forum is the new BRICS multilateral guarantees initiative. That might sound a bit barbarian to our audience, so I'll try to make it slightly simpler. What that basically means is that the new development bank would try to use this sort of guarantee fund to make financing cheaper overall. What such a guarantee usually does is that it mitigates political risk and in general mitigates risk in investing in developing countries. So that is supposed to be able to attract further private investments mostly. So the private investor would have part of his risk diminished and thus would be willing to provide financing at a relatively lower cost. There is a similar initiative within the World Bank framework. The MIGA exists and has actually been quite efficient in stimulating more private finance towards the developing countries. It also helps significantly with providing financing to small and medium enterprises, which would be crucial for countries in the South. So this new guarantee within the new development bank would be available to BRICS members and to the other members of the new development bank, and thus hopefully stimulate a lot more financing going into development initiatives that can be climate or non-climate related. This could be infrastructure that the southern countries need as well badly. So I think this is a very important point of progress, though it might not be striking when you read the declaration at first, but it's actually one of the things that could potentially create a lot of meaningful impact.
Thank you so much. This is super interesting. Before we move on, we will have to speak a little bit about Iran, Ukraine, Gaza, just to prepare you. We've talked about sort of the tangible stuff, the cooperation mechanisms. Just ahead of the summit, the study came out that BRICS has 180 now, apparently with the new declaration, 180 plus coordination mechanisms. This is something, at least outside the BRICS countries, not many people are aware of, that there are BRICS youth games, BRICS cooperation on the protection of big cats. I mean, these are sort of small things, but also on counterterrorism, exchange of parliamentarians, whatever that means in some of the countries, cultural exchanges, technology. And maybe one of you or all of you can give us a little bit of an insight. How does this go beyond talk shop and coordination? Are there actual cases where regulation nationally has changed and been adapted? Overall, is there actual policy adaptation going on? Or is it simply a coordination of, well, we better know what you're doing so we can kind of, manage expectations? So if one of you had maybe an example where this has worked beautifully, but also examples where sort of this mechanism has been created and it's largely inactive. And maybe this is a question connected also to the lack of institutionalization. Brazil had a quite strong agenda, if I understand correctly, to try to at least make BRICS more predictable, to assign clearer roles to countries, to avoid that stuff is said one year and forgotten next year. And obviously, these mechanisms are part of that. So maybe we can address this sort of larger body of questions now, because this also leads to where will BRICS be in 2030, right? Because with the expansion, we need it's not sustainable to say one thing next year and then forget it in 2027. So who would like to start on that? Damyana.
May I start, Miriam,
Sure.
with a personal anecdote? As new members of the BRICS, my institution, ACDA, wanted to join the BRICS think tank forum and the academic forum of the BRICS. It wasn't entirely clear what the process was. By looking at just the website, it wasn't really obvious what the process and procedure is. So we have to thank our partners in SAIIA for putting us in contact with other partners in RF, who are different think tanks in the different member countries, to figure out what the process is. So yes, some of the procedures are not very clear and obvious for the new joining entities. But what I noticed is how quickly and easily things end up working out, because people are very willing to collaborate and to cooperate and to integrate the new members. So in a matter of, I think, a week, we were able to figure things out, to do the necessary steps, and with those partner entities, become a member of the BRICS think tank network. And what's interesting is that this year, though we weren't able to be part of it yet, but it seems that the recommendations of the BRICS think tank network were provided to the BRICS Sherpas ahead of the forum with the recommendations, and they were able to be integrated, which means that these entities or venues are not just talk shops. There is actual meaningful results that they might not be huge from every single group, but there are avenues for them to actually contribute to the discussion and to the policy making. So I think that possibly those could be streamlined and more clarity can be introduced into the way things are managed, but there are useful venues for collaboration.
Excellent. Sure.
Mihaela, go ahead.
So I wanted to mention that these mechanisms are closely linked to expansion, because every new country wants to bring own issues. And if the issues don't fit into existing working groups, you need to start a new working group. So this was a crucial, adding mechanisms is crucial for making expansion work. So getting the countries in. And another thing, it's very important for recruitment. So, and even like the socializing of BRICS and BRICS branding. So we did research on all different countries, the BRICS map, BRICS engagement map of all different countries that are interested in BRICS, and even countries that don't want to do, they really don't want to join BRICS, find one or the other mechanism that they really like, whether it's women entrepreneur training, or if it's like media, or if it's like BRICS media cooperation or BRICS fashion cooperation. So you would have a country that would never have any interest in either joining, but somehow they like BRICS fashion. So I think there is this component of it. And another thing is just the pure policy exchange. So I've seen that like in environmental working group, like talking, like when you have these big cities talking to each other about air pollution, or even in health group where you see like action on tuberculosis and exchanging basically experiences in a smaller format that was not there before. So I think these are some of the areas, but the areas that have most institutional output are the groups that were started back like 10 plus like 12 years ago. So thinking like agriculture, health, trade, like e-commerce collaboration. And I think when we look at these working groups, the question is like, I mean, how did the New Development Bank emerge? It emerged following work on the working group. So it's not like, you know, there is like like the end product. It's not everywhere, but let's say out of 180 mechanisms, if like 10 produce something, that's much more than BRICS currently have.
If I want to, and I think Damyana's anecdote is quite telling, because I think at times, even within the group, there is this question: is the agenda becoming a bit too broad? And I often see this comparison with BRICS counterpart, the G7, that it's far more narrow and focused on that. I think the other side of the coin is that when we look into G7 countries, primarily Western countries, they have multiple institutions that they engage with on a daily basis at multiple levels, whether it's through OECD, whether some members are part of the European Union, some members are not. But there is a much more homogeneous approach, despite its fundamental differences, that really is often presented as a criticism towards BRICS. I think the simple fact that we create the opportunities of interactions at various levels, and despite the fact that we normally focus on the summit at this big pinnacle of discussions, I'm increasingly of the opinion that it's far more interesting to look at some of the ministerial meetings, declarations, some of the work plans and so on, because they are the ones that actually provide the meat for the declaration. The announcements of these new mechanisms were not really it wasn't really an announcement that was debated here in Rio in the last week. They are results of multiple sectoral meetings and engagements that at times provide simple opportunities of interactions. Damyana and Agda and us at SAIIA started interacting far more this year simply because UAE is a member of BRICS, and we start identifying all sorts of ways in which research institutes can interact and create better partnership. But I think, and maybe just listing them, I'm not going to go into much details. There is a number of elements that really show that these continuous engagements can really provide some interesting spaces for better cooperation and additional avenues of strengthening societal approaches to things. I think one of them is certainly the vaccine issue, especially during and post-pandemic, where you have BRICS actively coordinating to develop global hubs for distribution, to ensure better access to vaccines in a period where there is a strong sense within the or there was a strong sense in the global south, there was vaccine hoarding within the global north, and really a very limited approach in terms of distribution of those. We are seeing a lot of that health cooperation taking shape and effect right now through other aspects. This new initiative and partnership of BRICS countries to eradicate socially determined diseases, which are very much part of many of the BRICS countries, is not simply a statement, but really a direct coordination efforts between public health institutions in all of those BRICS countries. We more and more see opportunities of collaboration in higher education, of development of standards and digital certification around agricultural exports and imports that provides members options. And I think the voluntary nature of those arrangements really start giving a lot of those tangible inputs and opportunities for countries that really, at sometimes, the idea of the talk shop is important because it provides them the possibility of finding a common ground, but increasingly so, this continuous the fact that if you're an official from a Minister of Agriculture or Ministry of Tourism or Ministry of Labor and so on, and that you're engaging with these other counterparts very regularly, that means that some of these decisions are very organic and they are often independent from what has been decided at heads of states level, because they're often far more technical, far more specific, and they provide a forum that it really doesn't exist for us in any other shape or form. So that it doesn't replace our interactions within other institutions and within other partners, but it really gives us the options of more choices, more approaches. And perhaps I think for an European audience that I think is always interesting to see, a discussion that is far less based on the idea of traditional aid and far more in terms of what kinds of integration we can do in terms of our societies, acknowledging that we see the world differently and that we are happy to agree on disagree on many issues, but it's always trying to find, are these things appropriate to be discussed here? Because if they're not, it's fine. There's other forums that can discuss that. But if there is an appropriate space to do that here, let's try to figure out, and maybe this will take some time, but we often see in very specific terms, we should be much more specific and much more tangible than what we are at the moment, but we increasingly see those examples that can clearly see benefits to our societies beyond this broader geopolitical imagination that there is about BRICS itself.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. And it leads me to actually perfectly to my next question. So BRICS seems to be, good in covering some of the gaps, for the global south, issues in the global south, and providing, as has just been said, opportunities to engage. But many of the states in BRICS, Brazil, India, Russia, China, they want to be really big players and they need to, engage with the big crisis of the world if they want to have impact in the world. So obviously I'm trying to lead on to questions on the big conflicts we are talking about and the different statements that were made on this really weird statement on Russia, impacts on Russian infrastructure. How did that made it? I mean, maybe one of you can elaborate what I mean, the impact on Russian infrastructure by Ukraine, and then the relatively strong condemnation on Iran, where this position had not been taken just previously by India. I mean, India rejected some statements by the Shanghai Cooperation Organization on Iran that were fairly similar. So I was just wondering if one of give us a short sort of your insights, what happened there, what are they doing, and is BRICS, despite its benefits on this sort of lower level, also an option for solving the big crisis? And does it need to be? Because I think the members clearly want that in some way or the other, either for them individually, probably not so much as for the group. Gustavo, maybe you said before you could say something on this.
Yeah, no, I think this is one of the interesting aspects because it's quite telling about some of the strengths of the group, but a lot of its own limitations that are well acknowledged internally. I think BRICS as a collective historically has struggled to really be more proactive beyond statements and beyond vague statements on a lot of critical issues, because the idea of achieving consensus means that the members have to agree to disagree very often, and they often pretty okay with acknowledging that on the war in Ukraine, BRICS is perhaps not the best positioned group to really address that situation, considering that one of its members is a party of that particular war. So in that sense, it's not only vague, the statement around Ukraine, but and we should read almost very cautiously the choices of words that are presented back. That is, we note back the national positions of BRICS members when it comes to the war in Ukraine, meaning that indirectly what the group is saying is that this is not really the right space. We had to agree to disagree, and there will be other opportunities for us to do that. If we look into this spectrum, you have Ukraine as where the minimum common denominator was so low that was to the point of irrelevance. On Iran, you have somewhere in between because it's more specific about condemning the attacks, but there is no specificities specifically about the role of Israel or the United States when it comes to that. And you have fundamentally only one paragraph around this. It's a broad statement that can include countries like India, for instance, or Ethiopia with its own proximity with Israel, politically and historically, that allows that minimum common denominator. The other extreme, which is not it didn't just happen this year, relates to Gaza. When it comes to Gaza, we saw in 2023 where there was an extraordinary meeting that South Africa called to discuss the situation in Gaza, where there was no agreement, and basically the only way to present some kind of a public outcome was a summary of the chair of the discussions rather than a common statement. Right now, as the situation evolves, there is a much more specific mentioning of situations, cases, developments, because not only are you able to find a different kind of consensus within members, but also much more that its members have engaged over the years. Meaning that for me, it's much more of a signaling of where the group is going towards. I don't necessarily see the group as being a major broker of geopolitical disputes internationally or regionally. And the group, in a way, identifies as that, yes, that is fine. We can find an agreement on this, but this is probably one of the issues that other institutions, other countries, and perhaps individually our members would be wanting to do that. And that's the only way that such a diverse group managed to deal with situations where you have bitter disputes. I doubt BRICS in the short run would start talking about water management in the Himalayas, considering the bitter rivalry between China and India. Even when it comes to some of the specific situations, we tend to see BRICS countries not really coordinating positions. Whether it's on Ukraine, you had the Brazilian initiative, the Chinese initiative, the African initiative led by South Africa. They were individuals and related to their own national positions. They were not coordinated as such as BRICS. And it shows, I think, once more that it's an expensive, not only in terms of members, but also in terms of topics. But BRICS countries stand to really easily take out of things of the agenda, including things that are quite important for Western partners, whether it's human rights, for instance, where a lot of the members, South Africa, Brazil, and so on, tend to align themselves much more with narratives and positions that are coming from Europe and are coming together with Europe, with inconsistencies, with challenges, and so on. But that is not, I think it's necessarily a fault of BRICS. It's simply a limitation that the group tends to be quite okay with deferring to other groups to deal with that.
Yeah, I actually think that's one of the strengths of BRICS, and other institutions could actually learn from that. Okay, we're already quite advanced in time. I'm going to ask a sort of multi-bullet point question that please all of you address quickly, and then we turn to the audience, and then maybe we come back again. So given what happened, is the institution strengthened or not? And what does all this mean for the Indian presidency next year? You may circle back to Xi Jinping and its absence. I mean, he hasn't been at the G20 summit in India. Do you guess, will he travel to India for BRICS summit? And what does it mean anything if he's not there? And where do you see BRICS in 2030? Sort of just pick and choose, sort of a concluding question on our discussion, and then we open up for the Q&A. And please post your questions in the chat there. And we'll start with Mihaela, please.
All right. So maybe what to expect for India's presidency. maybe we can look back at what are some of the continuous items on the agenda for India. One of the items was reform of global institutions. I think that will be stronger now as an agenda item, especially given the UN Security Council movements. And another item, counterterrorism. So that has always been on Indian agenda, sustainable development and climate justice, and possibly like innovation and digital technology. So these are kind of the standard India items, so to say, as well as trade protectionism. So also I would expect more work on BRICS agriculture, because that has been an agenda where there has been a lot of energy. And possibly India would be well positioned to work on the contingent reserve arrangement to kind of give it some life and action. So these are some of the areas. I think regarding President Xi, I think that BRICS is currently moving in the direction that China has tried to bring to bear for a long time. So now there is like increased more focus on trade, more focus on expansion. So I don't necessarily think that his attendance would have had a major impact on the agenda, and he sent very capable people instead, and they have been active. So it's not that I don't really see that he has been as necessary for this particular meeting. But I think for India, this has a much stronger symbolic value, because BRICS summits have been always like the show of unity between India and China, and they always made a point that even like after the worst conflict, or like when we had a militarized dispute between India and China, there was a strong point that they will show up at the BRICS summit. So I think this signaling and symbolism is more likely to continue than not.
Damyana, do you want to maybe comment?
I think that we should put things as well a little bit in perspective of what's going on currently with US tariff policies. A lot of countries are still in the process of negotiating deals with the United States to avoid the very hefty tariffs. And that could partially explain as well who went and who didn't go to the forum in Brazil. And there is also still for a lot of these countries the possibility to keep negotiating, because we just heard that the tariffs that were supposed to be in place as of today are not going to be in place until August 1st, which gives countries another 2-3 weeks to try and strike a deal with the United States. And I think that for a lot of the current members, and also for the newly affiliated countries, this is something that is of huge importance. We shouldn't forget that the US still represents about 12% of the BRICS trade as a trading partner. So it is meaningful, and the threat of new tariffs on those who align with the BRICS policies is clearly having an effect. So again, the anti-West messaging is very important for a lot of countries, especially in this particular month. So I think that could explain partially why certain countries were represented at a lower than presidential level, though that's speculation on my end, but I would have the feeling that part of that is explained this way. Now, whether the group is strengthened or not, I would argue that not having an additional expansion this year totally makes sense, because the organization needs to first properly integrate the current new members. We've doubled in size, more than doubled in size. And with all of these different mechanisms, it is important for things first to fall properly into place with the current 11 players, rather than have more and more newcomers join. So if the Indian presidency can keep things at bay for another year, I think that would be a good thing for the current members to first start functioning properly, cohesively, for everybody to learn their way around, and then maybe look for further expansions outwards.
Sure, Gustavo, would you
think-
like to? Yeah.
Yes, and I'll try to be very brief because I'm curious on the questions. I think the Brazilian presidency really showed this kind of fact that a country that is chairing BRICS has a lot of influence in shaping the tone of that year's discussions, but it does not really guarantee that the national positions of the chair will necessarily be included within final decisions. I think many of us would remember last year, and I know there was a lot of anxiety and fear in Western corners around statements made by Russia during the presidency last year, including images of President Putin showcasing a BRICS currency bill. Internally within the group, there is no actual discussion around a common currency because our monetary policies, our views is that like we may have concerns with the US dollar and particularly the idea of the US dollar as a common good, but rather as a political good that we highly benefit from in terms of liquidity, in terms of the ability of trading, and so on. But at the end of the day, the Brazilian presidency this year had some of those limitations. Brazil came very strongly with the idea of creating and reorganizing and rewriting the terms of reference for members and partners, the idea of rationalization, maybe exploring with some small institutions that could help with continuity, not to formalize the group. But that encountered a lot of different views from the members in terms of, well, terms of reference is 4 years old. It doesn't really fundamentally change. We need more time for certain discussions. So a lot of this have been deferred back to the technical working groups that will be very much part of the Indian presidency. And I think it does show some of these elements that the Indian presidency next year is really going to try to bring some of their priorities and issues that they're interested in. But we kind of already know what are going to be the big issues in there. We know that seeing what progress is made in terms of all of the baseline integration that is required towards an eventual and potential systems of payment that helps countries settle in trade with local currencies, not to replace the US dollar. There is too much value in having a currency like the US dollar at the moment, but it gives more option to diversify the risks inherent to the current situation. Issues regarding a lot of these technical aspects, discussions around rationalization of decision making. I don't think there is any momentum at the moment of talking about a new expansion. Even Indonesia that was announced this year wasn't a new expansion, but really the results of the fact that Indonesia had been invited in 2023. It was in the middle of an electoral process, and their response, which was quite immediate, told the members, like, we need more time. It's not the right time. We don't know what the results of our elections are going to be. And eventually they joined. I think in 2030, we really, I think we can almost extrapolate the incremental development that we usually see within BRICS. Developments within BRICS tends to be slow until you see some results. And I think it was very much part of the discussions this year within the context of Xi Jinping not showing up. The fact that the declaration unusually was presented right in the middle of the first day of discussions showcases that this was primarily a discussion led at the Sherpas level, or the leaders within the different countries, from usually foreign ministries, but often from central banks or ministries of finance, that there was, unlike what we saw in Johannesburg 2 years ago, where it took 3 days and the declaration was only agreed at 11 o'clock in the evening of the Thursday evening, and the declaration was presented early in the morning, meaning that the interference and intervention from heads of states was much more limited this year than what we had seen before. The reasons for why she wasn't here, there's a lot of speculation. The most plausible one for me has to do with this alternation of visits to Brazil, she having come to G20 last year, Lula having visited Xi in May, and all of these multiple visits are not really standard within Chinese foreign policy. But I think, and I think Mihaela mentioned that quite well, the Chinese were quite active in a lot of discussions. But from an image point of view, I think one interesting thing, and perhaps is me trying to see the glass half full or half empty, I think it gives a very interesting perception that BRICS moves on and is still able to make decisions, even if our largest economy and our largest partner is not present there from the highest level. Second in charge was there, but it still showcased a lot of continuity. We can still see a lot of Chinese language in there, but we still see a lot of moderation of Chinese language in many of those discussions that showcases perhaps. We talk a lot about the limitations of consensus, really hard to find at this stage, but there is a value in that is not about vetoing decisions, but much rather the process that is taken towards finding those common denominators. And that makes the decisions for any very different to what any member is usually looking for, because we have to find that middle ground, far more conservative than it seems, and I think far more incremental and long-term looking than what I think perhaps the Johannesburg summit brought way too many big decisions, and we keep expecting that we're going to have those bombastic summits. It's make BRICS boring again, and that is great.
That is a great statement. And sorry to the audience that we've took a little longer, but I see that many of your questions have been answered in our elaborations. For example, on the role of the host country, we have spoken about. We have spoken a little bit about the local currency and expectation about how to and when to reduce dependency on US dollars. I think we've covered that substantially. I would like to turn to, and I try to combine two questions. One pertains to the sort of mounting US-China rivalry and how the need for striking a sort of a balance between the two, particularly for countries like India. But I would like to also mention, and we said that in our discussion before this event, Vietnam is a quite interesting country which just now has gained partner status and just now seems to be the second country who concludes a trade agreement with the US. So how can this happen while maintaining BRICS solidarity in this sense? What is the tension in this, like about having to take sides? I think this is quite interesting. And let me connect that to a second question, which I do think is related. It actually asks about a lack of cohesion and identity from the enlargements, but I think this pressure to choose is part of that. So what does this mean for sort of the future development path of BRICS? May we see sub-regional groupings? Is there a new lifeline to IPSA? IPSA is India, Brazil, South Africa, which is sort of the democratic BRICS. So what do you see there in terms of whether something will change in BRICS in sort of having these small formats? And I might add one, maybe we can sort of have this one big round of questions. If you had advice, and I think that pertains to relationships to the democratic BRICS, for EU, German foreign policy makers, what advice do you have? Do you have like one key advice of policy adjustments in that regard of how to relate to BRICS? So 3-pronged questions. I hope you've taken all note. If you need to repeat something, let me know. We'll go in the reverse order now and start with Gustavo.
Thanks. Let me see if I can remember all of the 3 questions I was thinking. But I think the aspect of the expansion, there is definitely, if not an identity crisis, there is a soul-searching process in terms of what is the identity of BRICS post-expansion. And I don't think that for such an informal type of group, this is something that you resolve very quickly, because members do like the idea, the same with G20, the same with the G7, that you have mobility and flexibility of adjusting your approaches within that. I think for the sheer numbers, you certainly create incentives within, which existed before, but perhaps far less pronounced, in terms of small groupings that are often very thematic based. Like I don't see the idea of the emergency of a hyper-coherent IBSA within BRICS in every single topic, and this kind of countering China and Russia, or an A3 of the three African members always there's no voting, they're negotiating together and so on. But I think there are some incentives that we increasingly see. I think the issue of IBSA is an interesting one because I think for us, I'm Brazilian, being living in South Africa for the last 20 years, we don't quite see ourselves as the democratic part of BRICS, but we see ourselves as the predecessors of BRICS. In the 2000s, I still lived in Brazil in the early 2000s. IBSA was the game in town. This was the main coordination aspects of this kind of middle powers. And there's increasing talks around IBSA never died, but perhaps was never buried. There's some discussions, heads of states meet in the margins of the General Assembly and so on. But there is the question also of the disparities within the three now that is much larger than what it used to be, especially because India is such a large country that generates some questions around that. I forgot the other question, so I don't know if you want me to answer or maybe move on to the other ones.
Let's move on, and let's move on to the next one. There was this question from me about sort of advice for EU and this positioning between US-China rivalry. But let's move to Mihaela, and if you want to add something at the end, we'll go back to you. Mihaela, please.
I would say multi-alignment is right now the modus operandi in diplomacy. So it's completely normal for states to want to be associated with different bodies. Where Vietnam has been in a peculiar situation, but actually it came on the other side because now it has both like the BRICS partnership and the trade deal. So it was like diplomacy on fire on the Vietnam side. The question here is the relationship with the US that right now President Donald Trump is trying to reset trade relations. And this is not going to be a forever moment. So he has his chart and the negotiations are going on. So we're talking about like a very temporary intervention rather than like a I hope that this happening like long-term regularly, right? So I think right now this is an opportunity for the US to kind of rethink the relationships, but it's also opportunity for the BRICS countries to see how they can expand on the areas of interest. So in terms of IBSA, just to follow up on what Gustavo said, I remember reading South African foreign minister before joining BRICS was saying as one of the reasons like it will strengthen IBSA, and that was the idea. And then you look like decade plus later, what's left of IBSA and where is BRICS? So I'm wondering like with other bodies, like whether the same thing will happen. And then I was kind of having a deja vu moment because I was reading ASEAN countries joining BRICS and saying it will strengthen ASEAN. And I'm like, if ASEAN goes the IBSA way, but ASEAN is an organization, so it's institutionalized. So I don't think that will happen. And then finally, in terms of the advice for policymakers, I think this is a unique opportunity. What we are seeing right now, where BRICS is focused on basic needs, it's focused on sustainable development, climate change. For a long time, there was this talk about like emerging powers, emerging markets being responsible stakeholders, so to say. So now this is the moment to actually deepen on the sustainable development agenda and climate agenda and think about what's the future of sustainable development goals and all aspects of climate and how to address it. Another area, food security. And here I see not only cooperation among BRICS, but also ASEAN BRICS cooperation, because some of the things in the agriculture plan are something that ASEAN already does really well.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Damyana, I think we're going to do this. You're going to have the final word. There was a question. Sorry,
quite a responsibility.
There was something also on the impact on G20, on sort of BRICS. If you can respond to that, otherwise we'll have another quick opening of the mics for the others.
Sure. I would basically want to say that the good thing about BRICS is that it doesn't require its member countries to take sides. And I think that's the agility that everybody appreciates and the capacity to be flexible with the multi-alignment that Mihaela mentioned. Without that, it would have been very difficult for a lot of the new joiners to be members of the BRICS, because they have been strategically involved with many different parties, and the success of their foreign and economic policies depend on this multi-alignment. And as far as advice goes for the German, or in general the European government, I think that engagement in trade opening would be very relevant and very important with the current background of what's going on in trade and tariff proliferation. An example that we can think of is currently the EU being engaged in negotiating a comprehensive economic partnership agreement with the United Arab Emirates. So those kinds of, and with Mercosur and with other partners around the world, I think that this strategy to actually open up to trade more rather than protect from trade is a good strategy for European governments right now, whether at the EU level or at individual level, if feasible within the EU rules.
I think that's great. And let me get the word to Gustavo again, because obviously you're, in South Africa with the G20 coming up. So what are the links? So the question that was posed is, will the G20 be increasingly polarized along sort of G7 and BRICS members of the G20? Like, do you see any emerging gaps? And is there anything that can be taken forward or will be taken forward by South Africa from the BRICS to the G20 moment? We have about 2 more minutes. And if you have any sort of policy advice stuff, if you can pack that in 2 minutes, that would be fantastic.
Be as quick as I possibly can. I think there's certainly a lot of linkages between BRICS and G20. If you compare discussions on any given year between BRICS, G7, and G20, they tend to be quite complementary. I don't necessarily think, even though BRICS and G7 are the two big constituencies within the G20, I think it's far more nuanced than that. Because in certain discussions, taxes, tariffs, issues around wealth, and so on, the split is not along the lines of BRICS and G7. The split is very much between the US and the rest of the world. So I think there is a lot of that continuity. Some of that tension is inherent to those. And I think that bridges to my final brief comments around how I think European partners should be seeing that, because I think it's often a mistake to look into BRICS from a clash of civilizations, bringing Huntington back. That is us versus them. I don't think anyone is choosing. There is a diversification process, because internationally there is an increasing sense that no single major power or collective of powers, whether we're talking about the US, Europe, or China, and so on, they are super strong, but they're not strong enough that they provide all of the goods and things and partnerships that we want in every single level. I think that fragmentation and multi-alignment, multipolarity, and a lot of the terminology that we as academics and researchers are still grappling to find specific ones is not really what is happening. In so many ways, a country like South Africa interacts so much closer and so much more regularly with countries like Netherlands, Germany, France, and so on. But in many ways, there are differences of views and positions and approaches. I think it's thematic, it's multi-layered, it's nuanced. And I think the big mistake for a region like Europe is to perceive itself as in the center of the calculations of why this group exists, and that it's the opposing side of that. Bilateral, multilateral relations will continue. And if we continue thinking in terms of either us or without us, and we saw the impact of that in the aftermath of the invasion of Ukraine, that really separated discussions that should have not been separated. That continues, and that was detrimental to Europe. It was detrimental to its partners. that we're only now starting to better understand the implications, that the dialogue is multi-layered. One division and one disagreement in specific issues doesn't mean a full detachment or an opposition approach. And BRICS is not a homogeneous collective, and countries are not homogeneous collective. And I think that for me is the message going forward, particularly for European partners.
I think that was an excellent final word. And I think I did not promise too much when I said this is going to be a one-of-a-kind conversation that will bring information about the BRICS that you will struggle to find in one place. So please join me thanking to our excellent panelists. Thank you very much for the audience for sticking with us in such large numbers. This makes me very happy. If you would like to experience more of such events, please go to the GIGA website, sign up to our newsletter, and I hope to see you again very soon in this format. Thank you very much.